Hello, once again, and for the final time. This will be my final video dispatch of the year. And I wanted to just briefly review the material that is relevant for the final exam question. Now, I caution you that this review does not give you what you need to know to answer the question successfully. It will mention the key ideas that you will need to understand and explain on the exam. So please don't use this as a substitute for working through the arguments and supporting your answer with concise quotations from the text. This is just a very thin review to help you distinguish between what is of essential importance and what you want to go look at and review for purposes of answering the exam, and what you can leave aside for exam purposes. The exam has three parts, which correspond to the three parts of the course. But as I promised, the third part of the course is only touched upon lightly because our in-class meetings were disrupted before we were able to discuss together the work of de Beauvoir and Camus. However, and I did spend some time thinking about this, I thought that the integrity of the course required some component that touched upon the third part of the class. The class was designed to have three sections: the Platonic classical conception of philosophy, which is distinguished by the unified way in which it treats reality, truth, and goodness; the empiricist and skeptical criticism of that unity, as that was developed in the work of David Hume; and then the most radical implications of that criticism, which are found in existential philosophy, which maintains that while there may be truth and goodness and reality, we can never access an unchanging transcendent form. And so, for all intents and purposes, or for practical purposes, human beings are alone to determine, on the basis of their judgments and commitments, what is true and what is valuable and what is good. So the exam question tries to touch on each of those aspects separately, and then asks you to give a unified, brief but unified argument uh, in terms of supporting one set of implications or another. So let me go through each of the three parts of the exam, and then I'll offer some general advice and then sign off. So the first part shouldn't be too difficult to answer. We've already had um, two opportunities to touch upon the classical argument. So the first part asks you to explain the Platonic theory of the forms by explaining what Plato means by the unity of truth, reality, and goodness. And I think the crucial idea here is the idea of unchanging nature. For Plato, a true statement refers to an object, right, that is in the fullest sense of the term. To be in the fullest sense of the term for Plato means to be in an eternal or unchanging state of perfection. Right? If I say that paying your debts is justice, right? This is true only if there is a permanent form of justice. If justice is true in one context, and if justice is one thing in one context and another thing in another context, we can never have a completely true statement, because if the contexts change, then the truth conditions change. So for Plato, truth depends upon there being a form which never changes. And when we are able to express the nature of that form in language, we are connecting our subjective claim to the objective reality. They match up, remember? And when they match up, truth is guaranteed because it is anchored in this unchanging reality. Particular things, material things, come to be and pass away. Right? In one context, something is true about them. In another context, something else might be true which would therefore mean that what was once true is now false. But don't get too tangled up in the logic of change and contradiction. Focus on the unchanging realities and keep things simple and straightforward. The possibility of making true claims depends upon there being an object of those true claims, and true claims state the nature of the object or what it is, and therefore that nature has to be unchanging. So that's the connection between truth and reality, and goodness follows from that primary connection, right? When we say something is good, we are clearly, this is Plato's point, right? We are clearly intending that this is good in an absolute sense, not good for me, good for you, good now, good then, right? But good. When it comes to the good, we all want the real thing. Well, there we go, right? So just as truth connects to reality, so does the good connect to reality from the practical standpoint. When we do something good, we want it really to be good. If there's no form of the good, then we can never be certain that what we're doing achieves our objectives. Right? So the unchanging nature of reality is essential both for truth and for goodness. Plato's metaphysical argument contains his theory of knowledge and his ethics. Now, that was a very powerful philosophical argument, right? It by and large shaped thinking in the European and Islamic tradition for more than a millennia. But by the time the 18th century is well underway, skeptical doubts are being raised. We don't need to look in we don't need to discuss the detailed history of what social changes caused those skeptical doubts. But nevertheless, people like Hume began to wonder whether the history of classical philosophy was not a lot of really spinning of illusions out of our heads. Hume's criticism, and this is the second part of the exam, centers on human experience as the limits of knowledge. Hume maintains that meaningful ideas are always anchored in experience. And therefore, that of which we can have no experience, we can have no knowledge. And guess what? Plato himself tells us that it is impossible to experience with the senses the forms. We reach the forms only through a process of rational transcendence of the changing material world. But what we see with our eyes and hear with our ears and touch with our fingers and smell with our noses, all of that changes. And Hume says precisely, it all does change. And so does our knowledge. Knowledge is probabilistic. It's perspectival. It's rooted in our experiences. Right? Some explanations are better than others, of course, but only because there's more evidence for them. What evidence really is there, according to Hume, for something like the forms? Right? There's no evidence at all. Plato has spun an elaborate logical construction, right, out of his mind, because reason can certainly extend itself beyond the limits of experience. It's just that when it extends itself beyond the limits of experience, it's not talking about reality. It's a monologue. It's just talking about itself. There's no knowledge there, right? We could talk about the forms of leprechauns just as well as we can talk about the form of the good. Neither one nor the other has any more substance to it, right? So we must confine our knowledge claims to what we can provide evidence for. And that means that we can have no knowledge of any transcendent, unchanging, eternal nature. Well, what are the implications of that? There are many. On the one hand, Hume's and empiricist criticism open up different avenues for the experimental study of nature, and in that regard, they were highly influential in the emergence of modern natural science. But so was the Platonic mathematical side, right? So modern natural science is a synthesis of theory and observation and experiment, right? So that's one important historical implication. But for our purposes, the most important philosophical implication is that it opens the door to more and more humanistic, human-centered understanding of what is valuable and true and good. And the apex of that development is existential philosophy. As I explained in my first video discussion of de Beauvoir, the kind of the historical antecedents of existential philosophy, we should think of existential philosophy as subjective, right? As rooted in the powers of human beings as subjects. It's not that we make up the whole world, right? The books behind me are real. The chair I'm sitting in is real. The computer networks through which I'm talking to you are real, right? But what we do with them, how we value them, is totally up to us, right? The fact that a book exists exerts no mechanical force that I should read it, right? The contents of the book don't determine that I like it or what I take away from it, right? Likewise, the existence of other people does not determine how I relate myself to them. Only my choices determine that. So, the third part of the exam asks you to explore how Hume opens the door to existentialism, and then it poses a question, right? If Hume does lead necessarily to existential subjectivism, how might we nevertheless govern our activities in a way that takes into account the needs and interests of other people? In other words, how is it possible for an existentialist to still care about others, to still subject their decisions and commitments to universal rules, right? To rules that are binding on us all. Right? Or you can take a second approach, right? And the second approach says if you don't find the existentialist route convincing, right? If you don't think that the existentialist can coherently answer the question, how can I be, how can I take the interests of others into account if it's only my own good ultimately that concerns me, if it's only my own choices that determine things are good, how can Plato or something like Plato respond to Hume? Now, obviously, I can't tell you how to answer this third part of the question. We've been working together for 3 months to get you to a point where you can philosophize on your own, right? I do not expect you to produce completely original philosophical work, right? This is an introductory class. Nevertheless, there is little point to studying philosophy if at the end of 3 months you can't do a little bit of philosophizing. That's why we were studying, right? When we study anything, we're studying it so that we can then do it at the end. And you're all ready to answer these questions. But here's a couple of thoughts that might help. Okay. If you take the first route and say, yes, even though existentialism argues that value depends upon subjective commitments and choices, that we are condemned to be free, and that how we ultimately relate to other people and value them is a function of our choices and not any objective nature out there. Pay close attention to de Beauvoir's interesting arguments about what it means to will oneself freely. Right? If I understand the implications of freedom, right, my freedom, I will understand that other people are just like me, also subjects. And so de Beauvoir argues that implicit in existentialist ethics, even though it recognizes the ambiguity and the complexity and the groundlessness of our choices, it connects us with other people because if we understand our own freedom, we will understand everyone else's freedom. And so we will choose in ways that we can accept responsibility for. And can we really accept responsibility for choices that target and oppress and harm other people? Now, we might be able to. There's no guarantees in existential ethics. But if we have to be responsible for our choices, then that might put a brake on them. Right? It might teach us that if we really understand our freedom, then we have to take other people's freedom into account and choose goals and commitments that allow, as far as possible, everybody to similarly choose and pursue their own projects. Okay? So that's the type of problem that's the type of issue you want to focus on, right? What are the implications of my being free in a world of other people who are also free. If you want to take the second route and say, no, that's too dangerous, a groundless, an ethics that is ultimately groundless, that's not anchored in some transcendent reality, just allows us to do everything, right? Nothing is true and everything is permitted, as Dostoevsky said. So if you want to take the second route, then you have to find a Plato-like response to Hume. And here, that sounds really hard, and it's challenging, but we can do it, right? And you'll remember through all of the different criticisms that Plato would bring to bear on partial definitions, right? What Plato is showing us, or what he's claiming, is that while we might not have direct sensory access to the forms, we do have an experiential basis to their reality. In order to classify anything at all, there must be something in virtue of which the classification is made, and that's the form. Think back to our discussion of beauty. I know it's going way back to January, right? And you all had amazing examples of beautiful things, people, poems, etc., and so forth. And we discovered together, without even talking about a single Platonic argument, we discovered together that if there was any sense to calling these different things by the same name, by the same definition, there had to be something that made that classification true. And that would be the form. So that's the sort of argument you might think of making. Don't just repeat what I'm saying on the videotape. Please think it through for yourselves. Right? But that's one way you might go. And bolster your confidence by remembering that the whole class collectively discovered that. Discovered the function of the forms without me mentioning the forms at all. That was all purely generated from your own answers to my questions and then reflections on it. Okay, that's just by way of review. You have to show the work, as we said, right? We don't take the conclusions on faith, right? Spell them out. Use the texts that we studied. So let me conclude by talking very briefly about some strategies for success. The most important one is don't try and think what I want. What I want is for each of you to think through the material and provide an honest philosophical answer. That's all I want. Don't think what I believe. Don't think how can I give an argument that best accords with Noonan's philosophy. Don't worry about that, right? Attend to your own ideas and support them as best you can. That's what I want to see. Secondly, don't use secondary sources. Whether you cite them or not, you will fail. I don't want a bunch of quotations from other commentators, whether those are internet-based or from a book. I don't care, right? Studying philosophy will eventually involve becoming familiar with the secondary materials and all of the different complexities involved in interpreting different philosophers. We're not there yet. This is an introductory class, right? But philosophy, as I've tried to explain, is not historical research. We have to know some history, but it's living ideas. Bring these ideas to life by putting them to work in your own answer. So I'm really quite serious about this. I don't want a bunch of quotations from secondary sources. That's easy. Anyone can take a block from a web-based article and stick it in a paper. Who cares, right? That's not thinking, right? That's at best detective work. Do your own work, trust yourself. You do want to support your claims with reference to the text that we read. And again, not big chunks of 300 word quotations. That you're letting the text do the work for you. You do your work, the text supports it, right? But it is important as evidence that you understand what's going on in those texts, that in terms of just when you're making the most important claims, short, pithy citations, and just for the sake of your future academic endeavors, reference them through some proper referencing system. But don't go looking for secondary material, right? And I will know. I've been at this a long time. Trust me. I know how undergraduate students write philosophy papers. I know how professional philosophers write papers, I can tell, right? And I want your work, and you should want your work, right? You've been doing this for 3 months. You should want the opportunity now to show me what we can do, right? If we were going scuba diving, you wouldn't, you wouldn't accept that at the end of the course you just write some stuff down about scuba diving. You'd want to go under the water, right? You'd be excited. Maybe you'll be a little bit scared, but you'd still be excited and you want to do it. Same here, right? Going under the water is writing the final exam, right? So be excited about it, and and do your own work. That's what I want to see. Other than that, I realize that the times are stressful. We're dealing with an unexpected situation. Nevertheless, it's good to have important work to do, and this is probably not the most important work you will ever do in your life, but it is important, and so enjoy it, right? And let's be glad that we have important things to do. That our own community, although some people are suffering from the coronavirus, it hasn't gotten to the point of other places in the world. So we have the time and space to do the exam. Use the time and space that you have to do as good a job as you can. And I'm available by email, of course, to answer any questions you might have. If the questions are more complex, email me and I will let you know how to get in touch with me by phone. In closing, I had a great time teaching the class in the first 2 months that we were able to get together. I appreciate the energy you brought. We had some excellent conversations, and I look forward to seeing you in another philosophy class in the future. And I look forward to your exams. I'm about halfway through the papers. I should have them done by Friday. If not by Friday, certainly by the end of the weekend. So sit tight, and I'll have you those marks as soon as possible. In closing, stay safe, and I look forward to the final exams.